Hello everyone. So today we decided to finally bite the bullet and use our 2021 Dodge Durango RT Tow and Go for improved, hopefully, performance courtesy of AFE Power intake. This is a 5.7 liter. It's not supercharged, but it is a V8. We did run up until now a K&E standard drop-in air filter, but we figured, all right, let's just see whether all the hype is worth it and drop in something a little bit more serious. So AFE Performance is making it possible for RTs to use this part number of theirs for a closed box assembly of an air filter. And the reason you definitely want a closed box, even though some people don't use it, that's perfectly fine, I'm sure, but closed box is safer simply because these Dodge Durangos come with that ported hood, which has 3 openings in it. Yeah, you have this front, there's one on the left, and then there's one on the right. And if we focus in on down here, you can kind of see there's like a little silver strip you can see through the ported hood. That's the clamp that's holding the hose to the intake, or the tube, or whatever you want to call it, to the factory intake assembly of this RT. So if water is coming through here, you definitely cannot afford to have water sucked up by the air filter. Some people are using one of those sock covers. Some choose to cover this up in favor of air intake, except there are 2 problems with that. The sock cover may or may not work. It's supposed to prevent water from entering the intake, which could very well be the case. Can't say for sure, just seems maybe a little bit slightly riskier. Those of you who are choosing to seal part or all of this off in favor of an open air intake inside are technically risking some of the cooling benefits to the entire engine assembly, not just to the intake. So closed box makes sense to try to replicate, but hopefully with more benefits. Again, because of the way AFE put theirs together. All right, so we're going to unbox the filter assembly itself to see what's inside, and then we're going to take a look at the other 2 boxes and why we decided to do this. Some of you might remember from one of our videos before that we used this very same assembly for our 3.6 liter V6 Jeep Grand Cherokee Altitude 2018, and we dropped this assembly inside of that car, and it worked out pretty well. If you, again, check out the video on this channel if you're curious about that. So essentially this is the same idea, but except this time it's going into a much more powerful factory car, and we're gonna hope that this actually improves performance additionally. So you saw us unbox this whole thing. There are typical instructions in here, along with stickers. Thank God for those. Everybody knows stickers add at least 5 horsepower a piece. Hashtag just kidding. There is the actual cone assembly, and there's the part number for it right there, as well as size and dimensions. Make sure that you capture and retain the size of this filter. It may not necessarily have to be this specific part number, but you definitely want to know its dimensions, because at some point in time, maybe you'll decide to replace the cone, maybe you think that there's a better cone out there for the assembly, or who knows. So one of the mistakes we made in the past is we did not capture the exact size of this cone. It's important to do that. Also, you have the main airbox assembly. So the GT Momentum is going to essentially be dropped into the engine bay like so, and the intake piece is going to go up in place of the current assembly. So you have this as the main airbox in case it's relevant. That's just the Air Box part number for those of you that for some reason maybe looking for alternatives, or maybe you're trying to do some mods to the Air Box itself. There is the tube. The tube itself is going to go from the engine to the intake part. It's got this, of course, nicely engraved AFE power frame. There is the part number for it also, in the event that there's something you're trying to do with the tube and they're trying to figure out how to replace just the tube part. I don't know that AFE recommends that or not, but you never know. And we have the clamps that this thing comes with, as well as a couple of grommets. There's probably a part number in here somewhere, but maybe there isn't a part number. They're just clamps. You just get these anywhere, including your AutoZone, Pep Boys, or some other place. And then the actual connector that connects the tube to the actual engine part of the vehicle. You have this. So this overall is the AFE assembly. Now you will notice that we also have two additional boxes sitting here. This is not mentioned anywhere in AFE manuals, but after reading some reviews, one of the possible side effects, and this is very important, specifically for the Durango, of this install, is that it may not perfectly align between the airbox and the engine. So for purposes of us trying to figure out how do we best handle it, we decided to go with HPS connector. It's an offset. It'll make more sense once we unpack this and try and do the install, where it's about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch offset tube. It's a hard tube. It's not the one that comes with the AFE, but this will help us hopefully address the problem of misalignment. And there we decided just to be sure, we're not going to know until we do this install, to see which one of these will make more sense. This shorter one, and there's the part number for it right there. 4-incher. And the same exact idea, except this one is longer. And we're going to see if either one of these will help us address the likely misalignment problem that this assembly for some reason has, specifically with Durangos. Okay, we popped the hood, and of course we're now looking at the inside engine bay. Before people ask me more questions, I guess just as a random call out, the front tower strut bar is courtesy of, well, not courtesy, obviously we paid for it, but still, Grocery Getter Racing. Love the title. Guys are really responsive, put together really well. Love the look and feel of it. So seems pretty solid running that. And then standard engine cover, but did a couple of overlays with the Hemi and the top part from Reflective Concepts. Great place. The guys actually really know how to proactively consider possible errors because of applying these things, because you get two sets when you order from those guys. They end up sending you two sets of the cover, the lettering, and even the striping, which we chose not to do. We just didn't want to overkill it with too much red in here. Just kind of a nice pop, but very precisely put together, very nice. This is not necessarily a plug. It's not like we're sponsored or anything like that, but just thought I'd give it a shout out. Plus, chances are I'm still going to end up getting questions on the channel. So back to what we were talking about. Here is the stock airbox assembly for the 5.7, and what we were talking about before is in the opening of the hood we were seeing this band kind of popping through there. So this was the clamp that's holding the air filter assembly and the hose intake together. And obviously if this box, just by alignment with the hole up in the hood, if this box were open and did not have anything in it, there's a very likely probability of things coming through the holes in rain, snow, salt on the road, whatever, miscellaneous debris. So regardless, setting that aside, just wanted to call out kind of the alignment of things. Based on what we've seen, once this thing gets taken out, we are actually taking out not just the box and the hose and then the connecting hose over here, but this entire contraption is going to end up getting yanked out of here, creating even more room in the engine bay potentially. Maybe that's also a good thing. There's obviously a reason why this is here. I'm sure there are all sorts of answers for that. Not the question we're trying to solve. And the usual rippled, ribbed kind of hose approach, as opposed to those that advocate for a straight tube that the intake assembly, the new AFE intake assembly, is going to have. This allows obviously for more flexibility, easier to manage, move things around when you replace air filters. Plus, honestly, also just the engineering of the ripples creates greater surface area for potentially even better cooling. But there's also those that highly advocate for flat tubes so that the air being sucked through creates less turbulence hitting these ribs on the inside of the tube. So whatever, we can skip all that for now, and we're going to start figuring out how to actually get this thing out of here. All right, let's do a couple of side-by-side call-outs of corresponding parts before we do rip out, install, and what have you. So we have the external air inlet, or part of the intake assembly. Kind of an interesting thing over here with mine. It almost looked like when this was put in here, somebody had something extra going on and decided to just, you know what, forget it. I'm just gonna go and cut this off with scissors. Like, it's the weirdest thing. This was like this from the factory. There was nothing else here. Just like, thank you for quality manufacturing. Like, I probably could have done the same thing with an X-Acto knife. Whatever. Based on everything we're seeing, that's going to come out. And then that part is where this section is going to come in. Then we also have, obviously this whole box is going to be getting out of here. But how is it sitting there? Because it's obviously not moving. There's attachments of some sort. If we flip the box over, this is put together for these 3 holes. 1, 2, 3. So those should be corresponding with holes that are underneath the air box. And that's how we're going to be yanking this out, but making sure that rubber grommets that are stock to factory are kept in place. Meaning that, if you remember, in our parts bag that came with the AFE assembly, there's this rubber grommet type deal. So these guys go inside the box and into those holes and then get seated on top of, I guess, something that juts out from the car frame. So this only has one. The air box that came with AFE assembly has 3 of those holes. So based on our Jeep experience, I'm almost certain that when we go to try to rip this out, there will be at least a couple more of these rubber things that were actually part of the factory assembly. So just make sure that when you're pulling the box out, you're keeping an eye out for those. They may come up with the bottom of the box, or they may pop off and drop into the engine bay bottom someplace. Just keep an eye out for them and make sure you save those. As we're going through the part comparison, now we're looking at the aftermarket tube, the AFE tube, versus the rest of the setup. So before yanking the box out, you would need to disconnect this hose here. And then when that comes off, by the looks of it, is going to reconnect to the aftermarket tube over here. And then you also are going to have to pop off the sensor, the O2 sensor. So that should be a fairly straightforward unclip of that gray piece right there. But then the sensor itself, normally it's about a quarter turn in one direction or other, is going to later have to come off and be inserted in here and then reconnected on the factory tube. So that seems to be the pretty straightforward side-by-side comparison. Obviously the filter cone is going to go inside of this air box. And then the other call out, just by looking at the entire factory assembly, is it might as well go ahead and pop off the engine cover, because we're going to need easier access to the connecting hose here and clamp, or however it's attached there. It looks like this whole factory contraption also has at least one attachment. So just to get easier access, might as well just pop this off, which is a very easy to just put some pressure from underneath on the few sides. There are 1, 2, I think 3 or 4 connecting, not rods, but whatever, like plastic jut outs, and then those just pop out of their holes and the cap comes off fairly easily. Right, and although some might say you don't have to do it this way, but we're still choosing to unclip the top of the factory air box first, leave the bottom in there, because you want to see just exactly how it's sitting. Again, just a little bit paranoid about those grommets that are holding the box in place, how it's exactly attached down there before we start ripping things out. The factory connection of the hose to the airbox, I guess you could, if you really wanted to start take things apart in parts, you can unscrew that, take this off, and then take everything apart in parts. You don't really need to, so we're just going to leave that on to not waste too much time. The hose that we talked about was already disconnected. Just be gentle, just slowly but surely, just kind of back and forth, pry it off. You don't even need pliers or anything like that. Just after some pressure comes off with your fingers. And then couple of more attachments. So there's this attachment of the whole assembly, it looks like, to somewhere, you know, around the engine mount, and then also the part where the clamp is attaching the connector to the engine. So both seem to be a pretty good fit for a number 8 socket. I mean, this one you definitely need a socket or a wrench. This one you could of course do with a flathead screwdriver, but might as well use the same attachments for both. Okay, so we got the attachment off, we have the clamp all loosened. This is now just a matter of wiggling this thing off. Before we do, one very basic but important call out. It's very important, once you take this off, exposing the engine and the air intake, to, as soon as you can, put something over it, a cloth, towel, something, just to cover up that intake part, because you definitely do not want to have some sort of debris, some accidental something, you know, insects, something else flying in there. So whatever it is, just make sure to cover it up as soon as you take this off, which, you know, then we've done, of course, like so. The other thing probably should have mentioned when addressing the oxygen sensor. So the clip is just a push-pull, comes off pretty easily, but the actual sensor, to get it out of there, sometimes would just be an awkward angle. So instead, just figured, you know what, we're going to take the whole thing out, and once we take it out with the sensor in it, we'll have that much more room and ability to mess with how to get this thing detached correctly. Very important that you don't break this, because that's going to cost you a lot of money to replace the sensor. And then equally carefully reinsert it into the new tube assembly. And just as predicted, here is our airbox assembly from factory, and it has 3 attachment points, which is how it's so sturdy in there. And it has this kind of outside one down here, and then 2 and 3, which aligned with our aftermarket box holes, as you remember we talked about. Again, it's not as clear, I don't think, that you're supposed to make sure to keep these. So it's just going to be the matter of carefully finagling this box off of these mounts, but making sure that the rubber grommets are kept. Additional call out, now that we have gotten the bottom of the box out, and again, we're going to get those grommets out of there, but the box, the bottom of the box, is also attached to, again, that very carefully cut out intake piece. Now that intake piece is sitting underneath this rubber weather stripping, but it's not just sitting there, it's also additionally attached through this little doohickey that's attached through a hole in it. So when you're yanking this whole box out, also try to, if possible, preserve this just in case, but just realize that if you're feeling that it's not coming out as easily, just keep an eye out on your alignment of the intake part, as well as this green contraption that's likely stuck in the weather stripping. So we've preserved the green doohickey. It was using a pop-it tool. You want to carefully pop it off the top to try not to break it. Is it critical? Maybe, maybe not. I really doubt it, but it's always nice to try to reproduce the assembly the way it was intended. Plus, there was a hole drilled for it already in the aftermarket assembly. It was already provided with the intent that you're going to try to save it. And again, The grommets had got pushed or taken off the mount of factory, got pushed right back into the 3 holes. Now we're just going to take the box and finagle it onto the 1, 2, 3 mounts, while at the same time making sure that we've inserted the air inhale piece, I don't care what the technical term is, into the correct spot. And of course there's our box with all the attachments in place. So we have the grommets down there, went on pretty nicely. Again, just a quick maybe tip recommendation: when you're trying to seat this thing, take your time, don't rush, don't try to press too hard. You don't want to somehow crack the integrity of the box or screw it up somehow. Just take your time, wiggle it in, periodically check your alignments with the holes to get it seated. And then our weather stripping got reattached with the green thingy through a hole that the anchor holds it through, so we're good to go here. And here comes the filter part. This thing, once unwrapped, this is the oil-based application, so you can see some wet marks on there, and it already comes with a clamp around it, but this is the clamp that's going to go around the intake tube. The filter itself we're going to have inserted into the box, and then there is a larger clamp from the parts kit, the very big one over here, that's going to go around to clamp down on the plastic to hold the filter in place. And here we go, the 2 clamps side by side. There's where the tube's going to go. This is what we put around that's going to clamp down and hold the filter in place, and they're going to get collapsed or tightened, sorry, struggling with words, by what looks to be an 11 millimeter socket. Ought to do it just fine, shouldn't need anything else. And then maybe obvious, maybe not, up to you really, but stylistic anyway, call out as far as, figure if you're already spending money on this thing and if you're going to do any kind of showing or anything, or maybe not, maybe it just don't care for you, but do you really want to have these things sitting here up top and then pop, or by pop I mean being that much more shinier and clearer seen through the hole in the hood? No, maybe not. So you can go down that way and wrench underneath, or go in that direction, whichever, but just thought I'd call that out. Okay, we ended up popping the tube in and tightened down the cone clamp. This way, as we maybe finagle or move the parts around, this thing is kind of nice and solid in there. In my case, I really had to torque this down to keep it in there, especially with it being an oiled filter, kind of easier to have it slide in and out of the surround. So really clamp down on that. But with the tube popping in, do not tighten the clamp just yet until everything else gets figured out. Also, just to be careful, when you're popping the tube in, you may notice slightly, not anything significant, but still slightly, you may feel like there's a conflict with how the tube is seated with this line here. And just make sure that obviously, when you're trying to get the tube into the box assembly, that you're not somehow inadvertently screwing up the line. You're not applying too much force, and just gently, nicely work around it. There is a call out, so to speak. There's a dent. I probably should have shown, just didn't think about it. The AFE guys, definitely great job in thinking about this. In order for this tube to mount above this line, there is actually a routed dent intentionally made in the bottom of this tube, so it actually aligns with this pipe, so there really isn't contact if this thing is mounted properly. But still, make sure that you're not tightening this, because we still have a couple more things to go, from the hose to the O2 sensor to the connection to the engine. So there goes the hose connection. Not anything difficult, just had to, again, carefully and thoroughly rig it onto the attachment to the tube. We're good to go. Since on the factory assembly there wasn't a clamp here, we didn't do one either. I suppose you could if you wanted to. I guess we'll just see how the connection goes and if it's something that we think is going to be a problem or not, but can't imagine that it should be. So aside from the notes that we edited the video with earlier, just again highlighting Our fail during the process, after all that time talking about being careful and saying how we need to make sure that when we're removing the sensor that we don't break it or go too crazy, that's exactly what happened. The good news is that it's actually not as expensive as we were kind of worried about. It's $40 at the dealership, $30 at Amazon. And fortunately, the local dealer just happened to have it. Here it is. That's the full, I guess, barcode part number, and then sometimes on Google or whatever, it can be looked up this way, 05149279AC. And obviously, the term for it is technically not O2 sensor per se. That has to do more with exhaust and such, but this has to do with airflow, air temperature, intake air temperature, sensor, whatever it said in the video edits that we made. So just wanted to call that out. Additional correction that we're making is the fact that in the parts kit that came with the clamps, with the intake, the aftermarket AFE intake, thought that this was just an extra grommet to mount the air box. But in fact, because the guys were smart enough to obviously consider all this, this is a grommet that has to be put into the sensor hole of the new tube, and then there's a plastic insert that has to go inside that same grommet, and the sensor is going to go inside the plastic insert. So first the rubber piece goes into the hole of the tube, then the surrounding part goes inside this grommet thing, and then the sensor goes inside of that. And we finally have the finished product. So looks like so. We have our air inlet, box, nicely tightened down straps or clamps, air box tube right to the engine. So far so good. To be determined on driving experience and any kind of feel or what have you. Still, as much as the whole thing is pretty well put together and is seemingly decent value for the money, I would just have to give my biggest criticism, if any, the process of having to install the mass airflow sensor or internal temperature flow sensor, whatever. There are 50 different names of calling these things. And the grommet and the plastic surround into which the sensor mounts. I don't know why it didn't come already with those pre-mounted, but we finally figured it out, so it's fine, good to go. One other quick note, some folks out there have made comments about how for the Durango, the 21, that the alignment might be off. So when you mount the box and the tube in the assembly, then the tube and the engine intake do not line up exactly. Some people claim to have seen as much as like half an inch to an inch difference in offset. We were fortunate enough to not see that. If you do see something like that, I've seen a couple of reviews where people are recommending buying a hose adapter with an offset in it. Like instead of this connector, there's a harder connector that bumps out, slides over an inch or a half, and then comes back out for the tube to mount into. HPS is an example on Amazon. The ones that we got, we're just going to return. So let's see what happens when we drive this around. So we have it installed. We are merging onto a highway just to see how this goes. Throw us into sport mode. See how performance is, if we notice any major difference. So see how this goes. To start, everybody says, well, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people have said, well, it sounds great. The intake being put in, I love the sound. I am not hearing anything. There's no, unlike the Jeep, unlike the 3.6 liter V6 Jeep, where you could definitely hear that there is an intake, with the Durango, with the 5.7, there is nothing that we're hearing right now. There's no difference to the exhaust notes, to the something in the front. I don't know if it's maybe the firewall settings, maybe, or not settings, the thickness of the firewall, maybe it's something else, but there's nothing by the sound that would make you think there is an extra modification of some sort. But having said that, the one thing that definitely is apparent is the response time. So we are running a pedal commander throttle kind of timing delete, right? One of those plug-in plays where the pedal delay is greatly reduced, which is actually kind of a nice little mod and very easy to do. So with that, it's kind of tough to tell, well, is it the pedal commander module or is it the intake that's making the perceived gains? But we've driven around with pedal commander a while, and the responsiveness, I guess, and kind of the smoothness of acceleration and seemingly more power definitely is there. Something's there, something's different. Somehow the responsiveness is improved. So what can be said is, at least maybe it's just mental, maybe not, but something has gotten at least a bit better. So I guess it's going to have to be seen over time how much more power or how much perceived power we think we're picking up here. Bottom line is, we're also going to be putting the RT through a tune, and that's going to be another interesting experiment to see how that goes in about a month or so. Long story short, this intake is something that we are not hearing, but we're definitely feeling some sort of change. Hard to say, again, how this is worth it, not worth it. I think it's going to be something that's going to be driven by individual owner experience, but so far, so good. Hopefully it works out for all of you. So thanks very much for indulging this really long video and explanation, but really hoping that this is helpful for those who are not extremely techy, but still want to experiment and have fun with their cars. Thanks, guys.